Okay. So welcome to this launch of one of the culminations of our research project into research mobilities in primary literacy education, which was a collaboration of 3 universities, Sheffield Hallam University, Lancaster University, and University of Stirling, and was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. Can you give me the next slide, Gill? The resource has been now published, and I've popped in the link in the chat if you want to check it online. It's a unique methodological combination of 3 methodological strands, which we are going to briefly introduce now. There will be a brief introduction of the project itself by Cathy Burnett, then Gill Adams will talk about the first methodological strand, which is the qualitative approaches, then Juia Gillen on corpus linguistics, and Terrie, Lynn, Thompson on sociomaterial ethnography. If you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat as the speakers speak, and we will then take on all the questions after the presentations in the Q&A session. So we should have about 10 to 15 minutes to questions. So I think that should be plenty of time. So do you want to start, Gill?
Is Cathy going to say something?
Yes.
Oh, Cathy, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yes, so what I'd like to do just very briefly is to say a little bit about the project, contextualise what follows. We're not going to report on project findings or what we're trying to explore through the project in this presentation, but it would just help to get a sense of what the broader project is, I think, in understanding what we're presenting today. So the project, as Anna said, is called Research Mobilities in Primary Literacy Education. So essentially what we're interested in is how research moves to, around and among primary teachers with a particular interest on literacy research and a particular focus on England. We started this project with an interest in kind of what kinds of research were amplified for teachers in England, in a very particular context for literacy education, in a very particular context for evidence-based teaching, and also within a very particular sort of environment in terms of school organisation, and given changes over the last 2 decades in communicative technologies, which kind of open up possibilities for research mobilisation. So that was kind of our starting point. It's worth saying that I think that there exists a lot of work around and ongoing and already published around research mobilisation. I think it's worth saying is something about our particular kind of approach to this, which I think is distinct from some other work in the area. One of the points to make really is that we're interested in what happens rather than what's intended. So we're interested in the kind of research that does mobilise for teachers. And by research, we may or may not go into this, we think about research really quite loosely. This has become looser and looser through the course of the project, but we're interested in what does happen. We talk sometimes about how research mobilises in the wild, so for teachers in their lives and around teachers in their lives, rather than specifically what's intended by researchers. So that's one kind of key thing. Another key thing I think is that we've been informed very much by the work on mobilities by John Urry and colleagues. We don't use the word mobilities lightly as a synonym for mobilisation. We use it quite deliberately because we're interested in the sort of politics and the social implications of movements of research. So we're interested in why movements happen, and we're also interested in the effects of mobilities on teachers, on what literacy comes, on what research becomes in teachers' lives. And the other thing just to signal is that throughout the project, we've adapted a very kind of sociomaterial sensitivity to this. So we don't just see the movements of research as about the role of people or organisations or policymakers or whatever. We're interested in a whole range and exploring the whole range of actors who may be significant, you know, that might include hashtags or algorithms or whatever. So those are sort of some key points that I think are worth bearing in mind in contextualising what we're going to talk about. The other thing that I will say is that because we're interested in research mobilities in all their complexity and hybridities, the methods that we've adopted are really quite varied. And what they've done is they've allowed us to kind of enter into or become part of or construct, if you like, depending on where you look at these things, research mobilities in different kinds of ways, and kind of enter into research mobilities in different kinds of ways that we think foreground different aspects which are important to consider. So I will leave you with that and hand over to Gill, who's going to talk about the first kind of tranche of methods that we used in the project.
Thank you, Cathy. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the methods that we use to investigate teachers' encounters with research. And as Cathy said, what we were interested in was how the various sources, brokers and spaces combined, and we adopted a sociomaterial sensitivity. So just to talk a little bit about how we went about this, we really wanted to elicit teachers' stories of encounters with literacy research in their everyday lives, and as far as possible to try and see their perspectives and work with them as much as we could within the framing of this project to co-develop some flexible and creative approaches. And as Cathy said earlier, we were really, what was really important for us was to try and evoke some of the materialities of encounters and the situatedness of professional practice. We had a longitudinal design at the outset, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But because we were doing this research in 2022 and schools had come out of COVID and there was a big emphasis on catch-up, it was quite difficult, I think, for teachers to engage in that. So we needed to adapt, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. So to try and do this, to get at some of these encounters, we use multiple methods of data generation and analysis. And these are the main approaches to data generation that we used, and I'm going to talk very briefly about each of them. So we started by inviting teachers to participate in an introductory workshop where we introduced the project, we talked about ethics, we had spaces for teachers to ask any questions, and then we started to elicit stories of their encounters with research using various kind of activities there. All of the work that we did with teachers was online for this, to try and encourage as many teachers as possible to participate. And we tried to adopt an approach that was open and exploratory and really kind of responding to what teachers were saying. So teachers came to this introductory workshop, they went off to record some of their encounters with research. They came back to focus groups, went off again to record, and then came back for interviews. And that was in the first phase. As I said earlier, we adapted the approach. So later on, we used a single focus group and condensed our methods within that single focus group to make it a little bit easier for teachers to participate. So the way that teachers were asked to think about recording their encounters with research was using life logging. And this is developed from the work of Frigo, and it's a framework to support them to gather, process and retrieve information. And Frigo wrote about this as an approach that attempts to accommodate the elements of mess and chaos and the complexity in everyday lives. So it was really appropriate for our project. When we introduced it to teachers, we encouraged them to be flexible, to find something that would work for them in their setting, that wasn't going to interrupt too much what they were doing, and to be creative if that was what they wanted to do. So people used a range of approaches. So you can see here, one teacher took a photograph of an English magazine that they'd got as one of their encounters. Others took screenshots of social media posts. Some used notebooks and post-its, a whole range of different approaches to record their encounters with research. And we used quite a lot of visualizations actually, and engaging with those. I think we engaged with them more creatively as the study progressed. And this is kind of what we'd asked teachers to do in some of the sessions. So to create a visual representation of how they saw research moving to and from them. So working from their logs or in the single focus groups to think about that, and encouraging them to get up and move around the spaces that they were in, to be reminded by things that were around them as well of what they saw. So I'll just show you some examples of some of the visualizations. They were really varied, really rich and varied. So there's just 3 examples here. On the left, there's an extract from one teacher's log. They'd used an online collaboration board and just taken a screenshot of some training they'd been on, and then made some notes, reflective notes in response to that. So they'd gone beyond, in a way, the logging and started reflecting and noting their reflections. And then the middle juggling act was created by a teacher in conversation with another teacher in a focus group. And they were thinking across their encounters and thinking about research using an online tool. And the very grainy image on the right-hand side is from a screen grab from one of the online sessions, where a teacher had been asked to respond to the prompt earlier, and they'd drawn themselves on their bed there with a pile of books at the side of them and multiple tabs on their laptop open. And this is kind of them representing their encounters with research. So what did these methods do? I mean, I think one of the key things for the teachers was it gave them space to reflect and connect and share with other teachers. And it started to mobilize research even within the project as well, as people shared things and noted things that other teachers had talked about. It gave us some access to teachers' reflections, to their stories of how things are and how things were, their hopes for how things might be in terms of research, and stories of research connections that had been sustained and enriched, and of missed opportunities. We thought they were quite powerful, those methods of data generation coming together. And I just want to talk a little bit about, with 2 examples here, of what the multiple methods did, because I think they gave us really rich insight. So the pairing of methods, so the life logging and talk, first of all. So one teacher had taken a screenshot of a social media post, the Ofsted English review, and then when they came to talk to us online, they reflected on that, and it enabled them to realize that actually something that was happening was they were seeing a lot of research, finding a lot of research, but not necessarily engaging with it fully. So that was something that they noted. And then pairing the visualizations with the talk again was really valuable. So the sketch is a teacher's drawing of how they saw research moving to and from them, and then talking about it. And that enabled us to see a little bit more about how that felt. So the teachers talking there about feeling maybe a bit isolated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the analysis now, the approaches to analysis. One of the first methods that we used was a kind of storying approach, where we worked with fragments of interview data, kind of extended extracts from interview data, and started to try and map what we saw going on there, how we saw research moving to, from, and around the teachers. So this teacher here, teacher 10, was talking about Ofsted targets and how they'd led to policy development and taken them to some of the CLPE, Power of Reading work, and on to Deborah Myhill's Playful Pedagogies. So then we worked from these mapping diagrams to try and create stories. So this is a start at one of the stories from this mapping diagram and interview extract. And this really helped us get at some of the depth of what was going on. And with the stories, we exchanged them back and forth as well, and got different insights from each other as we swapped them. Another key approach to analysis was the systematic noting of mentions of research. And this, Cathy alluded to this, this was quite complicated because teachers talked about all kinds of things when we asked about research, and it came to them from all kinds of sources, and some of them are noted there, the kind of range of sources. And this cataloguing of mentions really helped us get at what they were engaging with and what they were encountering in terms of literacy research. So we categorized the topics and the sources and looked at brokers and channels as well. And the mentions of research really varied in detail, and sometimes we had to do quite a lot of digging to figure out what it was actually that they'd mentioned. And then the third main approach was the thematic analysis. And we used reflexive thematic analysis, and it involved, I mean, you can see there on the slide some of the challenges that we faced in using that. And I think what was really valuable throughout that process was that we were working in a team, and there were constant discussions back and forth, trying to make sense, both within the team working on the thematic analysis and with the wider project team. So it was a real iterative process. And then finally, in this part of the work with the teachers, the combination of methods really helped us get a rich tapestry of teachers' experiences. And I've put this image here. We asked an artist to interpret some of the fragments, some of the data extracts. And for me, this is a reminder that multiple interpretations of all of these fragments of data are possible and really valuable. So I'm going to stop sharing there and hand over to Julia.
Sorry about this. I'm we had a rehearsal just before we started, and I managed to get my slides up, but I'm now struggling. I've got multiple screens coming up. So sorry. Right, one participant can share at a time. Right. I'm so sorry. Just can't get what I managed to make happen before. I can't make my slides appear. I've got two big screens.
I'll just download them, Julia, and then I could share them from here.
Thank you so much. I'm bluffing completely. I've got big numbers 1 and big numbers 2, and nothing coming. Right, has that done it?
Yes, brilliant.
Oh, marvellous, so good. Right, okay. So, right, phew. Now try to, so corpus linguistics, but I've now got to try and work out how to move it on. Right, corpus linguistics is actually a wonderful methodology, and what I want to do today in my 10 minutes is to actually encourage you to try it if you haven't already, and show a little bit about what can be done. So I'd say there are 2 approaches to corpora, although they can be combined, as indeed we did in this project. And one is you can use an existing corpus. So at Lancaster University, for example, one of the pioneers of corpus linguistics, then we've made massive corpora, as many other universities and centres in America and other places have, which are huge collections of kind of language overall. You can get them from many different languages, from many different countries, from many different periods. So this 100 million word corpus is a collection of British English in 2014. And it's done in such a way as to reproduce an original format for one done 20 years earlier. And what a corpus is an enormous collection of texts that are put into a digital format. And this enables 2 forms of approaches to it. You can look quantitatively, so you can look, for example, how frequently does a word or phrase happen? What kind of genres does it happen in? Or you can look qualitatively, because the distinctive and really important affordance for many of us researchers is that you can always, by just one click, go back to the text in its original occurrence, its original authentic context. So you can do any qualitative data and discourse analysis that you want to. So just to say something then about kind of existing corpora, I find it difficult to imagine any topic really in social sciences, arts and humanities, or even perhaps some scientific investigations that couldn't benefit from corpus linguistics. So say, for example, you're interested in trees. You could look at how people talk about trees. Do they talk about them differently now from 20 years ago? Do people talk about them differently in America and the UK? How did the people talk about oaks compared to Leylandii, for example? How did Charles Dickens write about trees? What mentions are there of trees, and what different kind of connotations are there? So it's one real thing that I would recommend is to you start to play with corpus linguistics by looking into a topic that you're interested in. Now, another thing that can be done, which we did very much with this project, is to create your own small specialist corpora. So you have specific things that you're interested in. In our case, is obviously research mobilities in primary literacy education, and you construct specialist corpora to look at this, so as to form a huge collection of texts that you can then investigate. So, in fact, in our project, we, and Anna's very much the expert here, created 3 corpora. So the first one, a media corpus, the second, Twitter corpus, and the third, which I just mentioned briefly, a teacher corpus. So we created a media corpus out of newspaper discourse. So newspapers are a kind of proxy for public discourse. Obviously, it's impossible to get a complete coverage of everything that everybody's talking about at any one time in a particular society. But newspapers orient to different audiences and can reflect different attitudes on topics and show what's fairly established, show what's newsworthy and so forth. So very worthwhile investigating. Twitter, in the era that we're working in, which is before the Elon Musk involvement and eventually takeover, was in what Chadwick calls a hybrid media system, very much underpinning some of the news discourses, feeding off it, completely unrelated sometimes. But we also knew from pilot work that it was a place where some research brokers, some teachers, those newspapers, all the sorts of agencies that we saw mentioned in that last slide of Gill's, many of them were active on Twitter at this time. So it was another venue that was very worth constructing a corpus around. Thirdly, the smallest corpus, very small in comparison to the others, was we created a corpus of what the teachers said in those focus groups and interviews and everything that you've heard about. That was very small, and it was very typical of the kind of corpora that I often create, which is to collect a certain amount of data, put it into a corpus linguistics program, and then I can use it in various ways. So if you want to get started with corpus linguistics, there are some free programs that you can use. For example, LancsBox at Lancaster University, which, as it said, can incorporate visualizations, can work with any language, can do lots of various kind of linguistic annotations and so forth. Similarly, there's AntConc, made by Lawrence Anthony, a friend of ours indeed, who also has made a very kind of simple to get started with freeware corpus analysis tool. So also strongly recommend that. So the media corpus then, so we worked with the LexisNexis database through which we had access through our university, as most, I think, UK universities probably do. And the first thing that you have to do that takes an enormous amount of time is to pilot the use of various search terms. People, when they're thinking or talking about research, don't necessarily use that word, for example. So you, on the other hand, you can kind of think up terms that are too broad, and you end up with a corpus that's far broader than what you want. So what you have to do is to pilot combinations of various different search terms, keep looking at a sample of the results and see what works. And in this case, it was the combination of the search terms primary, literacy and education that we were able to use to create the best possible corpus of primary literacy education research discussions in various ways. And this led us to 426 newspaper articles, obviously a number that you can read through, but you can also investigate. So quantitatively, for example, if you look at frequencies, obviously normalizing them because so that you're looking at them across scales, then we found immediately, as an important but interesting result, that most of the discourse in the newspapers was about reading rather than writing to a very substantial extent. So frequencies is one tool. Another important one is collocations. What words co-occur closely near to each other, not necessarily immediately next to each other, that is more frequently than by chance. So if we look at reading, for example, the first collocate of reading was comprehension. So that's kind of quite important to know that so public discourses, first of all, it's more about reading than writing. Reading comprehension is the salient concept there. Then the second one was love. So the next thing that you can do, for example, is you can dig into any one of those in detail. So we looked at love, for example, and immediately get this. You can create these concordance lines that show you how love appears. So love of reading is very frequent. Love of reading is something that can last a lifetime. And I think the real points here for qualitative researchers is to emphasize that you just click on any one of these lines and then you bring up the whole text and you can see it in context. So by looking at that, we could find, for example, that love of reading almost always meant either explicitly or implicitly print books, not reading on screens. That's obviously, you know, an interesting finding. So moving on, so looking at Twitter, and it was the period when it was Twitter, we were able to use the tool available here and Python. And again, a very important stage that takes quite a bit of time is looking at which search terms will bring you the best corpus. And in this case, it was primary, school, and literacy. And so we got 31,600 tweets, retweets, quotes, and replies. And Anna, using Python, was also able to ensure that for each of those tweets, we got the account information, we got the performance metrics, how many, how many followers are there in that account, for example. And we started talking about influential tweets. What is an influential tweet? So we decided at this point to look at the tweets, so just the tweets, the posted tweets, and then see how many were retweeted frequently. And again, you play about with these levels, kind of +3, -3, +10, and so forth. And we found that a very meaningful boundary seemed to be 4. If a tweet was retweeted at least 4 times, then it becomes a certain number of tweets that we can investigate. What's the content? You know, what are they talking about? What are the topics and so forth? Obviously, I can't go into that in detail, but you will see a lot of detail in the resource. So another thing then, which is the influential accounts? So this is a different point from the influential tweets. Which are the influential accounts? So we found that across the 3 years, these 3 were influential every year. So we've got there a little bit of information about the account, the description of it in the account, and then sort of one sample tweet for you to see. So Nelson Mandela, Penguin UK Books, and Clarence House, all very significant and influential tweets continuously across the, influential accounts across the 3 years that we were looking. So I want to just end then by saying that apart from all sorts of linguistic analysis, really anything you can think of, whether it's quantitatively based or more qualitatively, there are also lots of other things you can do when using corpus linguistics. So one example with the Twitter corpus, for example, was looking at hashtags. And by looking at hashtags over the years, we could see how some were consistent and some kind of spiked here and there. Another interesting starting point for further investigation as to what topics are influential and why. How are they appearing and disappearing? Which ones are remaining fairly consistent and why? And obviously then you can dig into them as deeply as you want. Another thing that you can do is visualizations of all sorts. This is one using Palladio, which was just when we looked at university accounts in this data set. Where were they? So perhaps unsurprisingly, most of them, as you'll see, were in the UK. But it was interesting for us as well to see what other universities were tweeting in ways that appeared in this data set. So thank you. I'll now do my best to stop sharing, hopefully take less long than I took to share, and hand over.
How do I move my slide back? How did you do that, Julia?
I think I'm the last person you should ask, Terrie.
I figured it out. I'm too indoctrinated by Teams. Okay, so I'm here to talk a little bit about the sociomaterial ethnographies. And this was definitely a team effort, and nice to see most people from the team here today. So, so we're going to describe sort of in the next little 10 minutes our approach to examining research moves and the assemblages that were implicated in those. So looking at the ways that actors were combining to mobilize literacy research. So very much looking at the work and labor, who and what is doing this work, and how then the research may sort of shape as it moves. So it is a very ambitious undertaking to say that you're going to attempt to follow various pieces of research, given that however tangible they might seem at the outset of this activity that you're doing, of your digital field work, they quickly disassembled and reassembled into a myriad of fragments. And this is just a partial list of what they were. So in order to handle that challenge, we ended up meshing together several different methodologies: network ethnography, controversy mapping, and object interviews. So I'll just talk about each of those. So network ethnography is interested in identifying and analyzing networks and the connections that make up those networks. It has a particular interest in trying to look at the work and labor that's going on within those networks, and also very focused on studying mobilities critically. And so in that way, I think it aligns with what Cathy was saying at the outset about our interest in mobilities from sort of a more critical political social perspective. It's interesting too, because it is a sort of combination of ethnographic work and some form of quantitative network-like analysis, but how it's actually taken up ranges quite a bit. So you may read some studies that have a highly ethnographic component and some that sort of just seem to look like social network analysis. But what we wanted to do as we were trying to figure out sort of what these networks were like and what they were doing and around sort of different research moves is to take a closer look at some of the relations and some of the sticky points within these networks. And that's where we turn to controversy mapping. So, you know, intuitively, it would seem like controversies are really about disagreements and arguments, but Venturini and Monk, and that's whose work we drew on heavily for this, describe controversies really as tensions which animate issues, and a way that particular research, for example, would shift between sort of matters of fact, like something that's sort of stabilized and accepted, to matters of concern, something which is getting disrupted, moving, shifting, questioning. Venturini and Monk position this within a larger STS sense of observing science in the making. They have a big emphasis on digital methods, which suited what we wanted to do in terms of looking at things online, but in these sort of hybrid on and offline configurations. And they outline 4 to 5 different stages that a controversy might move through. So that got us quite a long ways along. But then what we wanted to do, although those other two perspectives are influenced by actor network theory and STS kind of perspectives, we wanted to also bring a stronger, more than human and new feminist materialism kind of look at this, to dig a little bit deeper at sort of who or what is at work when we talk about sort of these different research moves and sort of shifts in the research itself. And so here we turn to the idea of interviewing objects to deepen how we can attune to and analyze human thingly, but also digital interactions in our ethnographic fieldwork. And this is work that I've done with my colleague Cathy Adams in Canada. And we have various sets of heuristics, such as following the actors, borrowing from Bruno Latour's work, writing these descriptive data anecdotes, and then unraveling translations, which is based initially on the sort of work of Michel Kellon. And so the idea of interviewing objects is just to try to get a glimpse of these kind of objects in their interactions with humans, and sort of what is actually unfolding in those kind of spaces. So what we did want to do is we set out to follow the actors. And it's not, as the last bullet says, it's not really a matter of connecting the dots, but it's letting the appearances and movements of the research, or lack of visibility and traction, guide how the digital fieldwork unfolds. And this is very much a feeling your way through the data. And as the first bullet goes into, it's about attuning to, it's tracing, but it's also searching for and noting appearances of different kind of actors, which can be anything from ideas, places, practice, money, politics, alliances, affective things, and organizations. All of those being actors implicated in research movements. And then, of course, trying to stay open to the unexpected, to the little things that sort of seem unusual, and possibilities within the seemingly everyday and mundane. So, yes, we were interested in websites and infographics, in blog postings, in metrics, in search page results. I mean, I don't think there was a digital thing online that wasn't looked at. I mean, we didn't look at everything online, but certainly we seem to be interested in quite a lot. So what we did is there was 9 case studies selected, or 9 cases selected for us to examine these different sorts of research movements. This list of cases evolved over a fairly long period of discussion within the entire research team, and was informed by data that was emerging from the other 2 aspects of the project, which Gill and Juia have just described. And it was these selection of cases were selected quite purposefully for their diversity. And this is an image that's taken actually from the toolkit or the resource itself. So actually most of what I'm talking about is in the resource. So this is something that if you're interested, you can go back and have a look at more closely. So this is just an example of some of the things that sort of popped up, different kinds of activity on blogs and Twitter. You can see on the left side, websites like Reading for Pleasure at the OU, the DOTS project. Here we have under Critical Connections an actual handbook for teachers available digitally or otherwise. And we did go back in time. So when we were interested in funds of knowledge, we're looking back at some of the original work that was done around this in the US. This one that we have here sort of in the middle of the screen is from 2005, but the work for that goes back into the 80s. So this was very much obviously an iterative process of collection, analysis, and it unfolded over 3 stages. So at each one of these stages, it was always about seeing, well, where are we at? What do we have? What do we know? And then how can we start focusing, and where are some of the interesting avenues to explore? And it was in stage 1 that we started to identify people that we would like to interview, like actual human people. And as a way of trying to help us better understand some of these digital moves, the people that we did interview reflected a range of different sort of brokers. We engaged in various different kinds of visualizations than what Gill and Julia have described, but also very highly caught up in visualizations. And then in the last stage, we had an analytic framework that we used to try to read across the cases and deepen our understanding of that. And these 3 stages are explained in more detail in the resource, and the analytic framework is there as well. I just highlighted the ghostly data, which comes from Lisa Blackman's work, because in addition to sort of attuning to what was present, we were also trying to attune to what was absent, which of course is quite challenging. And so what happened when we hit stage 2 is we went out and did more data collection, because then we started to realize that certain things became more interesting. As you can see in the middle of this slide up towards the top, the thing that says Our Planet, we became very interested in the digital films that were created by students and teachers as part of the Critical Connections project, and sort of how they were materially embedding particular kind of research, but the very many translations that actually led to that taking place. So just more examples of some of the things we encountered. So as I mentioned earlier, we had this sort of mix of meshed together qualitative and quantitative approaches. I would not call this mixed methods. I think it was much more messy than that. But we did lean towards more qualitative dimensions, not wanting to revert to the more familiar forms of social network analysis or data representations that drew more on big data. And partly the reason that we wanted to do that was trying to keep the networks from not being flattened, and trying to do what we could when we were looking at the networks to basically understand the relational aspects, the dynamics, and sort of the textures of those networks. But one of the first things that we did was start to develop these ideas of the data anecdotes, which is one of the heuristics that comes with sort of interviewing objects, which are these very descriptive accounts that weave together human and thingly sort of storylines. They tell stories. They are a form of data. They help you gather data, and they are actually a form of analysis. And out of that, you get a sense of sort of certain practices that unfold, that get enacted, and it often brings into the fore some things that are less noticed. But we also worked then a little further into more specific understandings of what was happening within these various research moves and how the research itself was becoming differently. And here we did go to Calonne's work, Michel Calonne's work on translation, which is around mediations, transformations, and displacements. There's a big focus with this work in trying to understand how some positionings become more powerful, which actors and combinations of actors become influential, and how sort of things get stabilized, even if it's temporary. Borrowing and drawing also on network ethnography, very much interested in the labor, and especially the invisible labor that might go into certain kinds of research mobilities. Calonne outlines 4 moments of problematization, which we worked with, but I think we also adapted these as we went. That's explained a little bit more in the resource. So there is an interest in controversy mapping and in network ethnography around sort of certain forms of data aggregation. So even though we were interested in more qualitative things, we did experiment with many things, and this was largely Anna's work around Google Trends, Voyant, Issue Crawler, Gephi. We had Media Cloud, Palladio, tweet analysis. So we had different forms of these kinds of data aggregations, which enabled us to work across larger swaths of data and perhaps see some of that data a little bit differently than we might have otherwise. We also had an interest in sort of creative ways of mapping and visualizations. And all of that is just, as I said before, to try to sort of keep the sort of vitality of these networks visible as we were trying to work with them. So these maps and visualizations, some were generated through data aggregation, some through more qualitative means, some were done with the help of various digital technologies, and some simply were done by hand or post-it notes on a wall. So we had a range of ways that we tried to work through these. They were both, they're all partial. None of them we would ever claim as an entire representation of anything. And many of them served as analytical stepping stones for us. They weren't necessarily ever intended to be something final that we would present in something like this, but rather something that is a stepping stone to get you to think a little bit different with your data. And just to end with a few examples, David created this wonderful notion of the ephemera. We didn't want to sort of lock ourselves into a watertight list of all the various kind of actors and assemblages that we might see, and especially since they give and change seemingly every second. We wanted to go with something that Venturini and Monk refer to as more fuzzy clustering. We also, when we were looking at the very many sorts of actors and assemblages present, for instance, in the critical connections case study, we described those in about 1.5 pages of text, and then we asked ChatGPT to create an image of that. So this is by no means is necessarily how I would have represented it, and it doesn't really matter. It's another form of mapping. ChatGPT also then sort of gives you a description of why it's got a tree in the middle, why it's got balloons up above, what all those roots signify. And it becomes a great way to sort of think a little bit differently about your data. You're trying to figure out how the algorithm's coming up with some of this stuff, but you wonder what you might inadvertently be overemphasizing or perhaps not sort of thinking about closely enough. And lastly, I end with these two examples of controversy mapping taken from Venturini and Monk's text. And this one deals with elephant conservation. That was the issue that they were using as an example to go through those 5 stages of controversy mapping. And all of this is taken from qualitative research data. So, it's just nice to show that mapping can be something that's quite different than a social network analysis type of map, although, of course, that would obviously be an option for you. So I think I will end there. And that's a little bit of an overview of what we did with our project, with this aspect of the project.